Hey guys, welcome back to Sleep into Power. I am NJ, and before anything else, I have a small request. Somewhere in the stillness where you are resting, let one of your hands become the center of your attention, and when you are ready, without hurrying, choose. Lift the left hand or lift the right. It does not matter which. There is no correct answer, no consequence, nothing waiting on the other side of the decision. Simply let the choice arrive, and let one hand rise, or let the intention form, even if the hand stays still. Perhaps you have chosen already, perhaps the left, perhaps the right, and in that moment something happened that feels entirely ordinary and entirely yours. A decision was made. There was a you who made it. That sensation, quiet and immediate, sits at the center of almost everything we believe about ourselves. It is the feeling that behind our actions there is an author, a self, who considered, weighed, and chose. Before we follow that feeling any further, I am pleased to share two things with you. My book, Sleep into Power, is now available. It explores the quiet influence of imagination, repeated thought, belief and identity, and how the ideas we return to again and again may help shape the person we gradually become. And Sleep into Power is now on Spotify, where you can listen to these documentaries and watch the video episodes as well, so you can enjoy them however and wherever suits you best. You are warmly welcome to follow the channel there. You will find links to both in the video description below. And now, let us return to the choice you made only a few moments ago, the small rising of a hand, and look more closely at what it contains. Yet there is a question hidden inside that simple movement, and it has troubled some of the most careful thinkers who have ever lived. When you chose the left hand or the right, when exactly did the choosing begin? It feels as though it began in the instant you became aware of deciding, but some experiments suggest that measurable activity may stir within the brain a little before a person reports feeling any conscious intention at all. If that is so, then the moment you experienced as the beginning may not have been the beginning. It may have been a later chapter in a story already unfolding. This does not mean the choice was taken from you. It does not mean a stranger inside your skull moved your hand. But it opens a strange and beautiful question. Where does a decision truly begin? Does awareness create the choice? Or does awareness arrive to find the choice already forming? And if so much of what shapes us, our memories, our temperament, our history, the countless influences we never selected, is quietly present in every decision, then in what sense are any of us free? We will not answer that question tonight in a single stroke, because no one honestly can. Instead, we will follow a decision on its journey, patiently, from its first hidden stirrings to the moment it becomes an action in the world, and we will ask at each stage whether freedom lives there, and what freedom might even mean. So let us take that small rising of a hand and follow it backwards, gently, into the hidden country where a decision may begin long before we notice it has begun. Consider how effortless it usually is to choose. Through an ordinary day, we make thousands of small decisions and barely notice most of them. We decide when to speak and when to stay silent. We decide where to rest our eyes. We decide whether to reach for something sweet or something plain, whether to answer a message now or later, whether to keep listening or to let our attention drift elsewhere. Each of these arrives with the same familiar sensation, the sense that we are at the wheel, steering. What is remarkable is not that we make choices, but how private and immediate the experience feels. When you decide to turn your head, there is no visible machinery, no sense of gears engaging. There is simply the wish, and then the movement, joined so seamlessly that the two feel like a single event. This seamlessness is part of why free will seems so obvious. The feeling of authorship is one of the most constant companions of a human life. It is with us from waking to sleeping. It rarely announces itself, and it rarely fails. But here we meet a distinction that will follow us through everything that comes after. There is a difference between experiencing a choice and understanding how that choice was produced. These are not the same, and the gap between them is where the entire mystery lives. You can feel, with complete sincerity, that you decided to lift your left hand. That feeling is real. It is data. But the feeling itself does not explain how the decision was assembled, any more than enjoying a piece of music explains how the brain turned vibrating air into meaning and emotion. We are, in a sense, expert users of a machine whose inner workings are hidden from us. You do not need to know how vision works in order to see. You do not need to understand memory in order to remember. And you do not need to know how a decision is manufactured in order to make one. The experience is delivered to you complete, polished, ready. What is not delivered is the assembly. So we should be careful with a certain quiet assumption, one that feels so natural we rarely examine it. The assumption is this, that because choosing feels like conscious control, it must be conscious control. That because the author feels present, the author must have written every line. Perhaps that is true, but the feeling of authorship, however vivid, is not by itself proof of how the writing was done. A feeling can be accurate. A feeling can also be a summary, a headline placed above an article we never read. Return for a moment to your hand. When you chose the left or the right, you experienced a clear sense of deciding. Now ask yourself something subtler. Could you say precisely where that decision came from? Not the movement, but the wanting to move, and the settling on one side rather than the other. Try to trace it back, and you find something curious. The choice seems to surface from somewhere you cannot see, arriving in awareness, already partly formed, like a word that appears on the tongue before you have consciously searched for it. That is the doorway. On one side stands the vivid, trustworthy feeling that we choose. On the other stands the honest admission that we do not directly observe the choosing being made. Between them lies the question this whole journey will explore, not to destroy the feeling of freedom, but to understand it more truthfully. Because whatever the answer turns out to be, the experience of standing at the moment of choice is one of the strangest and most intimate facts of being alive. Long before anyone could measure the brain, human beings were already arguing about whether their lives were truly their own. The question of freedom is not a modern invention born from laboratories and scanners. It is one of the oldest conversations we have, and every generation has returned to it with fresh urgency, because so much depends upon the answer. If we are free, then praise and blame make sense, and so do pride, guilt, gratitude, and justice. If we are not, then the entire architecture of responsibility begins to tremble. The ancient Greeks felt this tension acutely. In their stories, fate was a powerful presence, sometimes pictured as three figures who spun, measured, and cut the thread of each life. Their myths are full of characters who try to escape a prophecy and, in the very act of fleeing, walk straight into it. Beneath the drama lies a serious idea that perhaps the shape of a life is set in advance, and that our struggles are simply the way a predetermined pattern completes itself. Yet even within these stories, the characters agonize, deliberate, and choose, as if their choices mattered. The Greeks lived inside the contradiction we still inhabit, feeling fated and feeling free at once. Aristotle, one of the most careful minds of the ancient world, tried to bring order to this. He was less interested in cosmic fate than in the ordinary texture of human action. He drew a distinction that still shapes our thinking, between actions that are voluntary and actions that are not. If someone is physically dragged across a room, they are not acting, they are being moved. But if a person deliberates, considers the options, and acts from within, that action belongs to them in a way the first did not. For Aristotle, responsibility grew from this inner origin. We hold people accountable when an action flows from their own deliberation and character, rather than from external force or simple ignorance. This was a crucial move, because it located freedom not in being uncaused, but in the source of the action. What matters in this older view, is whether the deed arises from the person, from their reasoning and their settled character, rather than being imposed from outside. That idea will return many times on our journey, in far more modern clothing. The Stoics, who came a little later, took the question inward with remarkable clarity. They lived in a turbulent world of exile, illness, loss, and political danger, and they asked a practical question: what, in all of this, is actually up to us? Their answer was disciplined and, in its way, liberating. Much of what happens, they said, is not within our control. The weather, the opinions of others, the movements of empires, the failing of the body, even many of the events that shape our fortunes, arrive without our permission. But between the event and our response, they believed, lies a space. And in that space live our judgments, our attitudes, and the conduct we choose. External things happen to us. What we make of them, how we interpret and answer them, was, for the Stoics, the true territory of the will. One figure often associated with these ideas is the Roman emperor and philosopher Marcus Aurelius, who kept private notes to steady his own mind amid the weight of rule. His reflections return again and again to this dividing line, urging himself to release what is outside his power and to attend closely to what is not, his own thoughts, his own responses, the quality of his inner conduct. It would be a mistake to imagine these ancient thinkers had any access to the modern picture of the brain. They did not know what we now know, and we should not pretend otherwise. Yet they identified something that still feels alive. Whatever freedom is, it seems to have less to do with controlling the world, and more to do with what happens in the narrow, luminous gap between what befalls us and what we do next. That gap, that quiet interval between what arrives and how we answer, will become one of the central mysteries of this entire inquiry. The ancients located freedom there by intuition. Later, we will ask whether anything measurable lives in that interval at all. There is an idea so simple that a child can grasp it, and so vast in its implications that it has unsettled philosophers for centuries. The idea is this: everything that happens has a cause. Nothing simply appears from nowhere. A window breaks because a stone struck it. The stone flew because a hand threw it. The hand moved because of signals in a nervous system, which fired because of earlier states of the body and brain, which arose from earlier states still, reaching back through the person's history, their biology, and the long chain of events that made them who they are. This is the heart of determinism, the view that every event, including every human decision, follows from prior causes according to the regularities of nature. On this picture, the present moment is the child of the moment before it, and the parent of the moment to come. If that is true of falling stones and breaking glass, the deeper question is whether it is also true of choosing hands and forming intentions. If a decision is an event in the physical world, and if physical events have causes, then perhaps a decision, too, is the outcome of everything that came before it. For a long time, the triumphant progress of physics seemed to support exactly this vision. As scientists learned to describe the motion of planets, tides, and machines with astonishing precision, a picture emerged of the universe as an immense and perfect mechanism, a kind of cosmic clockwork, its every gear turning according to fixed and knowable laws. In such a universe, the future is not open in the way it feels. It is already implied by the present, waiting to be revealed, as the later position of a pendulum is implied by its earlier swing. The French thinker Pierre-Simon Laplace gave this vision its most famous and haunting expression. He asked us to imagine an intellect vast enough to know two things: the exact position and motion of every particle in the universe at a single instant, and every law that governs how those particles behave. For such an intellect, he suggested, nothing would be uncertain. The entire past and the entire future would lie open before it, like a landscape seen from a great height. It could calculate, from the state of the world today, everything that would ever happen, down to the smallest gesture, including the rising of your hand a few minutes ago, and every hand that will ever rise again. This imagined mind is often called Laplace's demon, though there is nothing sinister about it. It is simply a thought experiment, a way of making an abstract idea vivid, and its purpose is precise. It asks, if the universe truly runs on fixed laws, and if we ourselves are part of that universe, then are our choices any exception to the rule? Or are they simply more events in the chain, feeling free from the inside while being, from the outside, as determined as everything else? It is important to be careful here, because this is a philosophical challenge, not a proven fact about reality. Laplace was describing an ideal, an intelligence no being could actually possess, working from a picture of physics that later discoveries would complicate. We will meet those complications in time, when we turn to the strange world of the very small, where the clockwork image begins to blur. Modern physics does not simply confirm Laplace's dream. His demon remains a thought experiment, not a report from the frontier of science. Yet even as a thought experiment, it has extraordinary force. It captures a worry that no amount of everyday confidence quite dissolves. When you chose your hand, it felt like an opening, a genuine fork in the road with two live possibilities. But if every neuron that fired did so because of the state of your brain an instant before, and that state because of the instant before it, then perhaps the fork was always going to resolve exactly as it did. Perhaps the sense of open possibility is what a determined process feels like from the inside. Or perhaps, as we shall see, the universe is not quite the closed machine Laplace imagined. Either way, the question has been set, and it will not let us rest. To follow a decision to its source, we must travel into the place where decisions are made, and confront a fact that is easy to state and difficult to absorb. The vast majority of what the brain does never reaches conscious awareness at all. Awareness is not the whole of the mind. It is a small, brightly lit room in an enormous house, and most of the work happens in corridors we never see. Consider how much is being handled for you at this very moment without any effort on your part. Your heart is being paced. Your breathing is being regulated. The meaning of these words is being extracted from patterns of sound, matched against memory, and assembled into understanding, all before you consciously grasp a sentence. If a familiar face appeared before you, you would recognize it instantly, without searching your memory like someone flipping through a book. The answer would simply arrive. Recognition, like so much else, is delivered ready-made. This unconscious processing is not a flaw or a limitation. It is one of the great achievements of biology. If every action required conscious deliberation, life would be impossibly slow. Instead, the brain quietly automates whatever it can. When you first learned to walk, or to read, or to drive, each step demanded painstaking attention. Now those same skills run smoothly beneath awareness, freeing the conscious mind for other things. Habit is the brain's way of handing routine tasks to systems that do not need supervision. The same is true of much of our emotional life. A feeling of unease can rise in a situation before you can say why, as the brain detects a pattern it has learned to associate with danger or discomfort. A sudden warmth toward someone, a flicker of irritation, a pull toward one option over another. These often appear fully formed, their reasons hidden in processing you never witness. The conscious mind frequently finds itself not deliberating from scratch, but responding to inclinations that have already begun to take shape. Motor preparation follows a similar pattern. Long before a movement occurs, the brain must ready the muscles, sequence the timing, and coordinate a symphony of signals. Almost none of this preparation is available to consciousness. You experience the intention and the movement. You do not experience the elaborate groundwork that makes them possible. In this sense, every action you take rests upon a foundation you cannot directly inspect. All of this raises a delicate and important question. When a decision surfaces into awareness, Is consciousness the origin of that decision, or is it more like a reader receiving a report? Does awareness initiate the process, or does it arrive partway through to find preparation already underway, and then experience that arrival as the beginning? Here we must be extremely careful, because it is tempting to slip into a misleading picture. It is easy to start speaking as though there were two separate beings involved, a cunning brain that secretly makes decisions, and a conscious self that is fooled into taking the credit. That image is dramatic, but it is false. The brain is not a stranger operating you from within. There is no hidden puppeteer. The unconscious processes are not someone else. They are you, as much as your conscious thoughts are you. When we say that neural activity precedes awareness, we are not describing a betrayal. We are describing the ordinary structure of a single mind, most of which happens to work in the dark. That is the subtle truth we will carry forward. The self is not only the small lit room of awareness. The self includes the whole house, corridors and cellars and all. And so, when we ask whether a decision begins before we are conscious of it, we are not asking whether something alien has seized control. We are asking a stranger and more intimate question, whether the part of us that watches is the same as the part of us that acts, and whether the watcher was ever truly in charge. With that question held gently in mind, we can now turn to the experiment that made it famous. Chapter 5. Benjamin Libet and the Half-Second Mystery. In the early 1980s, a physiologist named Benjamin Libet, working in San Francisco, designed an experiment so simple in its apparatus and so profound in its implications that people are still arguing about it decades later. Libet was not a showman or a provocateur. He was a meticulous scientist interested in the timing of conscious experience, in the precise relationship between events in the brain and the moments we become aware of them. And he decided to turn his attention to one of the most personal experiences of all, the feeling of deciding to move. To understand what he did, we need one piece of background. Some years earlier, researchers in Germany had discovered that before a person makes a voluntary movement, a particular pattern of electrical activity builds up in the brain. Measured through electrodes placed on the scalp, this slow rising signal appears in the moments leading up to a self-initiated action. They called it the readiness potential. It was as though the brain began to lean toward a movement before the movement occurred, a gathering of electrical preparation that preceded the deed. This was a genuine and repeatable finding. The brain does show measurable signs of getting ready before we act. Libet's question was deceptively pointed. If the brain begins preparing for a movement, when, in relation to that preparation, does the person become consciously aware of the intention to move? Does awareness come first, as we would naturally assume, with the brain's preparation, following the conscious decision? Or does the preparation come first, with awareness arriving later? His method was ingenious. Participants sat before a specially adapted clock, on which a spot of light moved around the face far faster than an ordinary second hand. They were asked to make a simple, spontaneous movement, a flick of the wrist, or a bending of the finger, whenever they felt the urge, with no planning and no particular reason. There was no right time to move. They were simply to let the impulse arise and act on it. Meanwhile, electrodes recorded the electrical activity of their brains, capturing the readiness potential, and other instruments recorded the exact instant the muscle actually moved. Then came the crucial and delicate part. Libet needed to know when each participant first became consciously aware of the wish to move. So he asked them to watch the moving spot of light, and to note its position at the moment they first felt the intention. Afterwards, they reported where the light had been. In this way, Libet could place the conscious experience of deciding on the same timeline as the brain activity and the movement itself. What he found became one of the most discussed results in the science of the mind. The readiness potential, the brain's preparatory activity, began before the moment participants reported becoming aware of their intention to move. The muscle moved later still. The sequence, as Libet measured it, seemed to run in an unexpected order. First, the quiet build-up in the brain. Then, some fraction of a second later, the conscious awareness of wanting to move. Then, shortly after that, the movement itself. The preparation appeared to precede the conscious decision by a noticeable interval, on the order of a few hundred milliseconds, though the exact figures have always been the subject of debate. To many, the implication seems startling. If the brain begins preparing a movement before we are aware of choosing it, then perhaps the conscious feeling of deciding is not the true cause of the action. Perhaps, they suggested, the decision is set in motion beneath awareness, and consciousness is informed only afterwards, arriving to claim authorship of a process it did not begin. On this reading, the vivid sense of "I decided," the very sensation you felt when you lifted your hand, might be less like the striking of a match and more like the noticing of a flame already lit. We must handle these numbers and their meaning with real care, because this is exactly the kind of result that is easy to overstate. The timings Libet reported are small, and measuring the precise moment at which a fleeting intention enters awareness is extraordinarily difficult. We will come to those difficulties soon, and they matter enormously. For now, it is enough to sit with the finding in its most honest form. In a carefully controlled setting, brain activity associated with preparing a simple movement was detectable before people said they became aware of intending to move. That is a genuine and thought-provoking observation, but we must be equally clear about what it did not do. Libet's experiment did not prove that free will is an illusion, and Libet himself did not believe it had. As we shall see, he drew a very different and more subtle conclusion, one that concerned not the beginning of an action, but the possibility of stopping it. Before we reach that, we must give the doubters their due and ask a fair and searching question. Did this famous experiment really show what so many people took it to show? A striking experiment deserves striking scrutiny, and Libet's work has received it. Over the years, thoughtful critics have raised objections that are not attempts to dismiss the findings, but efforts to understand them properly. When we lay these objections beside the original result, the confident headline, that science had shown the brain decides before we do, begins to look far less secure. The first difficulty concerns the very thing Libet was trying to measure, the moment a conscious intention appears. Ask yourself honestly, when did you become aware of the urge to lift your hand? The question sounds simple, but the experience it refers to is faint, brief, and slippery. An intention is not a bell that rings at a definite instant. It can emerge gradually, shading from a vague inclination into a clear wish. Pinning it to a precise position of a moving light asks a person to report something that may not have a sharp edge at all, and the act of watching the clock, of trying to catch the moment, may itself alter or blur the very experience being timed. There is a second and related problem. Libet's participants did not report the moment of intention as it happened. They reported it afterwards, from memory, by recalling where the light had been. Human beings are not reliable stopwatches for their own inner states. The mind reconstructs the timing of events, and that reconstruction can be shifted by expectation, by attention, and by the ordering of experiences. A small error in this backward-looking judgment, an error of a fraction of a second, would be enough to change the apparent sequence entirely. When the whole argument turns on differences of a few hundred milliseconds, the fragility of the measurement becomes deeply significant. A third objection strikes even closer to the heart of the matter. What exactly is the readiness potential? Libet's interpretation assumed that this rising brain activity represented a decision already made, a command working its way toward the muscles. But that assumption can be questioned. Perhaps the readiness potential does not represent a specific decision to move at a specific moment. Perhaps it reflects a more general state of preparation, an anticipatory readiness that does not yet commit to any particular action. If the brain is simply idling in a state of heightened preparation, waiting for the moment to act, then the rising signal may be part of the background from which a decision emerges, rather than the decision itself. We will return to this idea in more detail, because it has grown into one of the most important challenges to the original interpretation. Then there is a question that lifts us out of the laboratory altogether. Even if we accept every measurement exactly as reported, what kind of decision was actually being studied? Participants were asked to flick a wrist or bend a finger for no reason, at no particular time, with nothing depending on the outcome. This is about as far from a meaningful human choice as it is possible to get. It is a decision deliberately emptied of content, stripped of deliberation, values, and consequence. The whole design required participants to act on a bare impulse, precisely the kind of near-automatic twitch we might expect to bubble up from below. Why does this matter so much? Because the decisions that give the question of free will its weight are of an entirely different character. Whether to forgive someone who has hurt you, whether to leave a career that no longer fits, whether to speak an unpopular truth, whether to remain beside a person through a long illness. These choices unfold over minutes, days, sometimes years. They involve reasoning, memory, imagination, competing desires, and moral reflection. To act on a spontaneous urge to twitch a finger may indeed draw on quick, unconscious processes. It does not follow that weighing whether to change your life works in the same way. Studying the flick of a wrist and drawing sweeping conclusions about the human will is a little like studying a single reflex and claiming to have explained the whole of thought. None of this shows that Libet was wrong to find what he found. The readiness potential is real. The timing was carefully measured. The result is genuinely interesting and worth taking seriously. But interpretation is where the caution belongs. To move from this narrow artificial experiment to the grand claim that free will is an illusion is a leap far greater than the evidence can bear. The honest position is more modest and, in its way, more intriguing. Something in the brain does appear to stir before we are aware of a simple urge. What that stirring means, and whether it tells us anything about our deepest choices, remains genuinely open. And remarkably, Libet himself thought the most important part of his findings lay not in how actions begin, but in whether they can be stopped. Benjamin Libet was not, in his own mind, an enemy of free will. He was troubled by the tidy conclusions others drew from his work, and he offered a subtler possibility, one that shifts our attention from the birth of an action to its final gate. Suppose he was right that the impulse to move begins beneath awareness, that the readiness potential rises before the conscious wish appears. Even so, Libet noticed, there remains a short interval between the moment we become aware of the urge and the moment the movement actually occurs. And in that brief window, he suggested, something crucial might be possible. We might still be able to stop. He proposed that while the brain may initiate an impulse unconsciously, consciousness could retain a power of refusal. The urge arises on its own, unbidden, but awareness can intervene to let it proceed, or to cancel it. Some have given this idea a memorable name. If the initiation of action might be described, loosely, as free will, then this capacity to halt an impulse might be called free won't. The freedom, on this view, lies not in generating every urge, but in deciding which urges are permitted to become deeds. There is something deeply familiar about this. Much of a mature human life consists precisely of not acting on impulses that arrive uninvited. Anger flares, and the sharp words rise to the lips, and yet we hold them back, choosing silence over damage. The wish for one more drink appears, clear and insistent, and we set the glass down anyway. The hand drifts toward the phone out of restless habit, and, catching ourselves, we let it fall still. In each case, the impulse was not chosen, it simply came. But whether it ruled us was another matter entirely. This reframes the whole question in a gentler and perhaps more realistic way. It may be that we are not the sole authors of every desire that stirs within us. Desires, urges, and inclinations well up from a deep and largely hidden source. Yet between the arising of an impulse and its expression in action, there seems to be a space, and in that space, something like choice may live. Freedom, if it exists here, would be less about commanding the first movement of the mind, and more about governing what happens next, about which of the many impulses we experience are followed, refined, or quietly released. We should not overstate this. The idea of a conscious veto is not established scientific fact. It is difficult to test, and it inherits some of the same measurement problems that trouble the original experiment. If it is hard to time the arrival of an intention, it is at least as hard to time the arrival of a decision not to act. Some researchers question whether the veto itself might also have unconscious precursors, in which case the refusal would be no freer than the urge it restrains. The power to say no may not escape the very net it seems to slip through. And yet, even as an open possibility, free won't points to something we recognize in ourselves. Whatever the deep mechanics turn out to be, the felt structure of self-control is unmistakable. We live much of our lives in the gap between feeling and doing. A great deal of what we call character, discipline, and wisdom seems to reside there, in the capacity to receive an impulse without being commanded by it. Perhaps the most human form of freedom is not the power to summon our desires from nothing, but the quieter power to stand for a moment between desire and action, and to decide which of the many voices within us will be given a body in the world. That space between impulse and action will return to us again and again, for it may be the very ground on which any freedom we possess is built. Libet worked with electrodes on the scalp, measuring electrical activity in fractions of a second. Decades later, a new generation of researchers approached the same question with a very different tool, one that could look not just at the timing of brain activity, but at its spatial pattern, deep within the tissue of the brain itself. The tool was functional magnetic resonance imaging, a technique that tracks changes in blood flow as a proxy for neural activity, allowing scientists to see which regions of the brain grow more active during a task. Among the most discussed of these studies was work led by the neuroscientist John Dylan Haynes, with his colleague Chun-Seong Soon and others, in the late 2000s. Their aim was to push Libet's question further. Libet had shown that preparatory brain activity precedes awareness by a fraction of a second. Haynes and his colleagues asked a bolder question. Could the outcome of a simple decision be detected in the brain even earlier? And could patterns of activity be used not merely to time a decision, but to predict which choice a person would make? The design was elegant. Participants lay inside the scanner and were asked, at moments of their own choosing, to decide whether to press a button with their left hand or their right. As with Libet, the choice was arbitrary, with nothing depending on the outcome. They also noted when they became consciously aware of their decision, using a stream of letters presented on a screen to mark the timing. Meanwhile, the researchers recorded the activity across many regions of the brain, and then used a method known as pattern analysis, in which a computer learns to associate particular configurations of activity with particular outcomes. What they reported drew immediate attention. By examining patterns of activity in certain areas of the brain, particularly in the frontal and parietal regions, the researchers found that they could predict, somewhat better than chance, whether a person would choose left or right, and that this predictive information was present in the brain a surprisingly long time before the person reported being consciously aware of deciding, in some analyses several seconds earlier. To many, this sounded like something close to mind reading, as though the brain had quietly settled the matter long before the conscious self had any inkling. Here, though, precision matters more than ever, and the true picture is far more restrained than the dramatic summary suggests. The crucial phrase is somewhat better than chance. If you were simply guessing whether someone would choose left or right, you would be correct about half the time. The predictions drawn from brain activity were better than this, but only modestly so, reaching, in some analyses, around 60% rather than 50%. That is a real and interesting effect, well above pure guessing. But it is a very long way from certainty. It means that even with access to detailed brain activity, the outcome could not be known reliably. The brain contained a faint statistical lean, a slight bias toward one option, not a settled verdict. This distinction is everything. A modest statistical tendency is not the same as a decision already made. Imagine watching clouds gather and being able to predict, a little better than chance, that it might rain. Your prediction carries some information. It does not mean the rain has already fallen, nor that nothing could change. Early brain activity that tilts the odds slightly toward one choice may reflect a developing inclination, a bias forming in the background, rather than a decision sealed and hidden from the conscious mind. The person might still experience genuine deliberation, and the final choice might still depend on processes that unfold as awareness arrives. We should also resist the temptation to say the scientists knew the choice before the participants did. They did not. They possessed a faint predictive signal, extracted by statistical analysis across many trials, that shifted the odds a little. No individual decision was foretold with confidence. And these were, once again, meaningless choices between two equivalent options, the very situation in which we might most expect random background fluctuations to nudge one way or the other. Whether anything similar governs a considered moral choice, or a decision reached after long reflection, is entirely unknown. So what did these experiments actually establish? Something real and something limited. Information related to an upcoming simple choice can be present in patterns of brain activity before a person reports awareness of choosing. That is a genuine and remarkable finding about the machinery of decision. But statistical prediction, modestly above chance, in an artificial task, tells us far less than the phrase, "brain scanners predict decisions" might suggest. It does not read the mind. It does not reveal a hidden ruler who has already decided everything. It reveals, at most, that the ground on which a choice will form begins to tilt before we notice the tilting. And even that finding, as we shall now see, may have an entirely different explanation. For years, the readiness potential carried a heavy interpretive burden. It was widely read as the signature of a decision being made unconsciously, the brain committing to an action before the conscious mind was informed. But scientific ideas are not fixed monuments. They are living things, revised whenever a better account appears. And in recent years, a different interpretation has emerged that reframes the readiness potential in a way that may dissolve much of its mystery. It is associated especially with the neuroscientist Aaron Scherger and his colleagues. To approach their idea, we need to understand something about how the brain behaves, even when it is doing nothing in particular. The brain is never truly silent. Its activity is restless, fluctuating, full of spontaneous rises and falls, a constant background murmur of electrical noise. This is not a defect. It is simply the nature of a system built from billions of interconnected, ever-active cells. At any moment, the overall level of activity in a region is drifting slightly up or down, without any external cause, simply as part of this ongoing hum. Now consider Libet's task from the inside. A participant is asked to move at some spontaneous moment, with no reason to prefer one instant over another. How does the brain solve such a problem? Scherger and his colleagues proposed a model. Imagine that the brain sets an internal threshold, and that a movement is triggered whenever the fluctuating background activity happens to rise and cross that threshold. Because the activity is drifting randomly, the crossing will occur at unpredictable moments, which is exactly what an instruction to move spontaneously requires. The decision to move at this particular instant is, in effect, handed over to the natural ebb and flow of neural noise. Here is the crucial consequence. If we record many such movements and align them to the moment of action, then average them together, what will we see in the moments just before each movement? We will see a gradual rise, because a movement only occurs when the activity has drifted upward far enough to cross the threshold. The apparent build-up, the readiness potential, would not be the trace of a decision made early and hidden from awareness. It would be an artifact of the averaging, the visible shadow of random fluctuations that happen to climb toward the threshold before the action fired. The rising signal would be real, but its meaning would be entirely different. Let me offer an image to hold this idea, and let me be clear that it is only an image, a way of picturing the mathematics, not a literal description of neurons. Think of a pot of water slowly heating on a low flame, its surface trembling with tiny bubbles that rise and fall at random. Most of these small disturbances come to nothing, but every so often, by chance, several gather together and a bubble breaks the surface. If you filmed many such moments and played them back aligned to each breaking bubble, you would see, again and again, a small swell rising just before the surface broke. That swell would look like preparation, like the water deciding to release a bubble. In truth, it would be the ordinary trembling of the surface, captured at the moments it happened to peak. The readiness potential, in this view, may be something like that swell, the mark of accumulated fluctuation reaching a tipping point, rather than the fingerprint of a decision concealed from the self. If this interpretation is correct, and it remains debated rather than settled, then the most unsettling reading of Libet's result loses much of its force. The brain would not be secretly completing decisions long before we know. It would be using its own spontaneous variability as a kind of internal dice, a way of choosing a moment when no reason favors one moment over another. The gap between brain activity and awareness would not reveal a hidden decider. It would reveal how a system generates a spontaneous act when asked to do so for no reason at all. We should not overclaim here either. The accumulator model is a serious and influential proposal, supported by careful work, but it too continues to be tested and discussed, and it does not answer every question. What it offers is something valuable for our journey, a reminder that the same piece of evidence can wear more than one face. The rising signal that once seemed to prove the brain decides without us may, on closer inspection, be telling a quieter story about noise, thresholds, and chance. And that should make us cautious about any confident verdict drawn from these delicate measurements, in either direction. Let us leave the laboratory for a while, and turn to something you can observe directly, right now, without any instrument at all: your own thoughts. In the quiet of this moment, notice the next thought that appears in your mind. Do not force it. Simply wait and watch. Something will come. An image, perhaps, or a fragment of memory, a word, a question, a flicker of feeling. And here is the strange thing. Before it arrived, could you have told yourself exactly what it would be? Almost certainly not. If you could have named the thought in advance, you would already have had to think it. Our thoughts do not announce themselves before they appear. They simply arrive, surfacing into awareness from a place we cannot see, already formed, as though handed to us by an unseen source within. This is one of the most overlooked facts of mental life, precisely because it is so constant. We speak of thinking as though we were the deliberate authors of every thought, composing each one on purpose. But watch closely and a different picture emerges. Thoughts occur to us. Memories rise unbidden, sometimes ones we would rather not revisit. A melody loops without our consent. In the middle of a task, the mind wanders off to some unrelated scene, and only later do we notice it has drifted. A solution to a problem we had set aside appears suddenly in the shower or on the edge of sleep, as if it had been assembled backstage and delivered when ready. Creativity itself often works this way. Artists and scientists frequently describe their best ideas as arriving rather than being manufactured, coming in a flash after a period of unconscious incubation. The conscious mind prepares the ground, gathers materials, wrestles with the problem, and then, often, must step back and wait. The insight, when it comes, does not feel like something we built piece by piece. It feels like something that surfaced. Even here, at the height of our apparent originality, the deepest work seems to happen below the waterline. If so much of what fills the mind arrives without being consciously summoned, then we must ask a careful question about the role of awareness. If we do not choose the arrival of our thoughts, what, exactly, do we do? Perhaps the answer lies not in the arrival, but in what happens afterward. A thought appears on its own, but then something can occur that does feel more like us. We can attend to it or let it pass. We can question it, follow it, develop it, or set it aside. We can notice a harsh thought about ourselves and decline to believe it. We can catch an anxious prediction and examine whether it is true. The raw material may be given, but the response to that material may be where our participation lives. This is a gentle and important distinction, and it must be handled with care, because it is easy to misread our own inner life. The fact that an unwelcome thought appears does not mean it reveals a secret wish, a hidden character, or a buried intention. Minds throw up all manner of images and impulses, many of them random, many of them meaningless, many of them the accidental collision of memory and association. A dark or strange thought that surfaces uninvited is not a confession. It is, more often, simply the noise of a restless and endlessly associating brain. What matters far more than the arrival of any single thought is the relationship we form with it once it has come. So we arrive at a quiet reframing of the whole question. Perhaps freedom, if it exists in the life of the mind, is not the power to decide in advance what will occur to us. That power we plainly do not have. Perhaps it lives instead in the slower, subtler capacity to notice what has arisen, to hold it up to the light, and to choose, over time, which thoughts we will nourish and which we will allow to fade. We may not select the seeds that blow into the garden. We may still have some say in what we choose to water. Where that capacity itself comes from, and whether it too is shaped by forces we did not choose, is a question we cannot yet set down. Chapter 11. The Unconscious Architect. If our thoughts and impulses arrive already formed, then we must ask what shapes them before they reach us. The answer, in large part, is the past. Not the past as a distant memory we consciously recall, but the past as it lives on inside us, silently, in the structure of the brain itself. Every experience we have ever had leaves some residue, and those residues quietly guide what we perceive, what we expect, and how we respond, long before conscious reflection has a chance to speak. Consider how deeply we are shaped by simple learning. Through conditioning, the brain forms associations between events, so that one thing comes to signal another. A particular smell can summon an entire scene from childhood. A tone of voice can tighten the chest before a single word is understood, because somewhere in our history, that tone preceded conflict. These links are not consciously chosen. They are laid down through experience, and then operate automatically, coloring the present with the emotional weather of the past. Habit works by the same quiet logic. When we repeat an action in a particular context, the brain gradually encodes the sequence, so that the context itself begins to trigger the behavior with less and less conscious involvement. This is why we can arrive at a familiar destination with no memory of the journey, the driving handled by well-worn patterns, while the conscious mind was elsewhere. Habits are the brain's way of conserving effort, but they mean that a great deal of our behavior is running on tracks laid down long ago, tracks we did not consciously design. Reward learning adds another layer. When an action leads to something the brain values, the pathways that produced it are strengthened, making the action more likely in future. Over time, this sculpts our inclinations, drawing us toward what has been rewarding and away from what has been painful. Fear responses do the same in reverse, teaching us, often below awareness, to flinch from what once hurt us. And all of this is threaded through with social influence, for we are creatures who absorb the expectations, values, and reactions of those around us, frequently without noticing that we have done so. Out of all these strands, the brain seems to be doing something continuous and profound. It is using the past to anticipate the future. Rather than passively receiving the world, the brain appears to be constantly generating expectations, predicting what is likely to come next based on everything it has learned, and then comparing those predictions against what actually arrives. On this view, much of perception and behavior is guided by a running model of the world, a set of expectations built from experience, quietly steering us before conscious thought begins. This idea, sometimes called predictive processing, has become influential in the science of the mind, and it offers a powerful way of understanding why so much happens automatically. If the brain is always leaning forward, anticipating, then many of our responses are shaped by predictions we never consciously made, based on a history we did not choose. We should be careful, though, not to treat this as a finished or universally accepted theory of everything the mind does. It is a promising and much discussed framework, not a settled account. The mind is almost certainly more varied and more surprising than any single model can capture. Still, the broad lesson is hard to escape, and it deepens our central question. When a decision surfaces into awareness, it does not arrive as a blank event. It comes trailing the whole invisible history of the person, their conditioning, their habits, their rewards and fears, their absorbed expectations, all of it compressed into an inclination that feels, from the inside, like a fresh and spontaneous choice. The architect of that inclination is not a conscious self weighing options in a neutral space. It is the accumulated past, working through a brain that was shaped by everything that came before. And this raises the most personal question of all. If we are so thoroughly built by our history, how much of who we are did we ever actually choose? Begin at the beginning, with the plain and startling fact that none of us chose to exist, and none of us chose the conditions into which we were born. You did not select your genes, that ancient inheritance which shapes your temperament, your vulnerabilities, the baseline of your moods, the very reactivity of your nervous system. You did not choose the family that raised you, nor the particular mixture of warmth or coldness, safety or fear, that filled your earliest years, before you had any words to understand what was happening to you. You did not choose the country of your birth, or the language that would become the medium of your thought, shaping the very categories through which you see the world. You did not choose the century you were born into, with its particular ideas, its opportunities, and its limits. You did not choose whether your childhood held books or hunger, stability or upheaval, encouragement or neglect. You did not choose the accidents of health, the schools within reach, the economic weather of your household, or the 1,000 early experiences that quietly wired your expectations of what life is and what you can expect from it. And yet, out of all these things you did not choose, something was assembled that you now call yourself. Your preferences, your fears, your reflexes, your sense of humor, your patience or its absence, the way you respond to stress, the people you are drawn to, the goals that feel worth pursuing. All of this grew from soil you did not prepare, in a climate you did not set. When you make a choice today, you make it as the person all of that produced. The chooser itself was shaped by forces entirely outside the chooser's control. This is perhaps the deepest challenge to the ordinary idea of free will, deeper than any single experiment. It is one thing to ask whether a particular decision was consciously initiated. It is another to notice that the self doing the deciding, with all its values and desires, was itself constructed by a history it never authorized. Can a person be entirely, ultimately responsible for becoming someone they never originally chose to be? When we praise or condemn a choice, are we reaching the true author, or only the latest expression of a long chain of causes reaching back before the person even existed? It would be easy to let this thought curdle into helplessness, to conclude that since we did not choose our beginnings, nothing we do is truly ours, and so nothing we do matters. But that conclusion moves too fast, and it ignores something equally real about human beings. We are not fixed at birth. We are among the most adaptable creatures on Earth, capable of learning, changing, and remaking ourselves across a lifetime. The soil we were given is not the whole story of what can grow. For alongside all we did not choose stands a genuine capacity for revision. People learn, they encounter new ideas that reshape old certainties. They meet others who show them different ways of being. They reflect on their patterns, and sometimes, with effort, begin to alter them. A person raised in fear can slowly learn safety. A person shaped by a harsh environment can, in a kinder one, discover new possibilities in themselves. The habits that history wrote are not always written in stone. Some of them can be revised, though rarely easily, and never from nowhere. So we are left holding two truths at once, and wisdom may lie in refusing to drop either. On one side, we are profoundly shaped by conditions we never selected, and any honest account of freedom must reckon with this. On the other, we carry a real capacity to reflect, adapt, and grow, to become, over time, somewhat different from what our beginnings alone would have produced. Neither fatalism nor naive self-invention captures the truth. We did not choose the hand we were dealt. What we may still have some say in is how, over the long unfolding of a life, we come to play it. Among contemporary voices, few have argued against free will as forcefully or as thoroughly as the biologist Robert Sapolsky. He has spent a career studying the biology of behavior, and he offers a challenge that is worth meeting in its strongest form, because a question this important deserves its most serious opponents, presented fairly and without caricature. Sapolsky's argument does not rest on a single dramatic experiment. Its power comes from accumulation, from the way many layers of causation stack upon one another, until, he contends, there is no room left for an uncaused chooser to stand. To see the shape of the argument, imagine any action a person takes, and then ask, at each level, why it happened. Begin with the moment itself. In the seconds before an action, the brain is in a particular state, its neurons firing in particular patterns, and that state produced the behavior. Ask why the brain was in that state, and you are led to the minutes and hours before, to what the person had eaten, how much they had slept, the stress hormones circulating in their blood, the sensory environment surrounding them, each of which measurably shapes how the brain responds. None of these were fully chosen in the moment. They set the stage on which the action played out. Widen the lens further. Why was the person sensitive to those influences in that particular way? Here we reach the months and years before, the experiences that shaped the brain's structure, the learning, the traumas, the relationships that tuned how strongly one reacts to threat or reward. Widen it again to childhood and development, when the growing brain was being sculpted by care or neglect, by security or fear, laying down patterns that would echo for a lifetime. Widen it once more to the genes inherited at conception, which set the initial parameters of temperament and vulnerability. And widen it a final time to culture and evolution, the deep currents that shaped the values a person absorbed, and the very design of the human brain across countless generations. At every level, Sapolsky argues, we find causes, and those causes have causes, reaching seamlessly backward. The action in the present is the product of brain states, which are the product of earlier experiences and biology, which are the product of genes and environment and culture, none of which the person authored. And here is the heart of his challenge. Nowhere in this vast interlocking web, he contends, is there a point at which some independent self steps outside all of it and chooses freely, uninfluenced by the whole chain. The self who chooses is, on this view, simply the sum of everything that made it. There is no separate captain standing apart from the biology, issuing free commands. There is only the biology, all the way down. Presented in full, this is a powerful and coherent position, and it should not be dismissed with a wave of the hand or a comforting slogan. It takes seriously how thoroughly we are embedded in the physical world, and it refuses the convenient fiction of a soul that somehow floats free of causation. Anyone who wishes to defend free will must pass through this argument, not around it. And yet it is not the final word, for it too rests on interpretations that others contest. One important response asks whether the argument sets an impossible standard for freedom in the first place. Seems to assume that to be free, a choice would have to come from a self that is itself uncaused, standing outside the whole web of influences. But perhaps that is the wrong picture of what freedom requires. Perhaps a choice can be genuinely ours precisely because it flows from our values, our reasoning, and our character, even though those things have a history. On this alternative view, having causes does not automatically cancel agency. We will explore that possibility closely in the chapters ahead. There is also a question about levels of description. To say that behavior is made of biology is true, but it may not be the whole truth about behavior, just as saying that a novel is made of ink does not capture what the novel means. Complex systems can display features that are real and important at their own level, even though they are built from simpler parts. Whether the reflective, reasoning self is one such feature, genuinely capable of shaping behavior, or merely a passenger carried along by biology, is exactly what remains in dispute. Sapolsky's case sharpens the question to its finest point. It does not, on its own, close it, and so we must turn now to hear the other side, and ask what can be said for the reality of human agency. Having given the deterministic challenge its full weight, fairness and honesty require us to hear the case on the other side, and it is stronger than the skeptics sometimes allow. For while it is true that all our choices have causes, it does not obviously follow that we are therefore mere spectators of our own lives. There is a rich and serious view which holds that human agency is real, meaningful, and consequential, even in a world where every event has a history. Consider what human beings can actually do. Capacities that set us apart from a falling stone or a reflex arc. We can reflect. We can turn attention back upon our own thoughts and examine them. We can reason, weighing evidence, considering consequences, and revising our conclusions when we find them wanting. We can plan, holding a distant goal in mind, and shaping present action to serve a future that does not yet exist. We can learn from consequences, adjusting our behavior when it leads us astray. These are not trivial abilities. They are among the most sophisticated processes in the known universe, and they are unmistakably part of how our decisions are formed. Think of what happens when a person genuinely deliberates over an important matter. They gather information. They imagine different futures and feel their way into each one. They notice their own biases and try to correct for them. They consult their deepest values and ask which choice they could live with. This process takes time, sometimes a great deal of it, and its outcome is not fixed at the outset. The decision that emerges depends on the deliberation itself. Change the reflection, and you change the choice. If that is so, then the reflection is doing real work. It is not a decorative afterthought pasted onto a decision already made elsewhere. It is part of the causal machinery of the choice. Here we reach a question that may quietly dissolve much of the anxiety around determinism. Does a decision stop being free merely because it has causes? Look closely at what we actually value when we speak of a free choice. We do not usually mean a choice that came from nowhere, with no reason behind it. We mean a choice that came from us, from our own reasoning and values, rather than being forced upon us by coercion, compulsion, or manipulation. A person who signs a contract because they have weighed it and judged it wise is acting freely. A person who signs because a threat is held over them is not. The difference between them is not that one choice has causes and the other does not. Both have causes. The difference lies in the kind of causes, and in whether the action flowed from the person's own considered judgment. This suggests that freedom may never have required being uncaused at all. That may have been a confusion from the start, a demand for something not only impossible but incoherent. What we care about, when we care about freedom, is whether our actions express who we are, our reasons, our reflections, our values, rather than being imposed against them. And that kind of freedom is entirely compatible with living in a world of cause and effect. Indeed, it depends on it. For without reliable causation, our reasoning could not shape our actions at all. There is more. Human beings possess metacognition, the capacity to think about our own thinking, to notice our motives and question them. We can catch ourselves about to act from anger and ask whether anger is a good guide. We can examine a desire and decide it does not deserve to rule us. We can respond not merely to stimuli, like simpler creatures, but to reasons, to considerations that we weigh and endorse or reject. A being that can step back from its impulses, evaluate them against its values, and act on that evaluation is doing something that looks a great deal like agency, whatever its ultimate physical basis. None of this refutes the deterministic picture at the level of physics. The reflecting brain is still a physical brain, running on causes. But it invites us to see that determinism and agency may not be enemies after all. Perhaps the reflective, reasoning, self-correcting processes we call choosing are precisely how certain causes produce their effects in a creature complex enough to model itself and its future. If so, then the question is not whether we are caused, but what kind of caused system we are. And that question leads us directly to one of the most influential attempts to reconcile freedom with a lawful universe. The idea that freedom and causation can live together has a name in philosophy. It is called compatibilism, the view that free will, properly understood, is compatible with determinism. Among its most spirited modern defenders was the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who spent decades arguing that much of the despair around free will comes from chasing the wrong thing, a kind of freedom that no one needs, and that could not exist in any possible world. Dennett liked to point out that when people fear they lack free will, they are usually imagining something very specific and very strange. They imagine that unless a choice springs from an uncaused source, some magical inner spark untouched by physics or history, then it cannot be real freedom. But he asked us to look hard at that supposed ideal and consider whether it is worth wanting at all. A choice that came from nowhere, connected to none of your reasons, values, or experiences, would not be a triumph of freedom. It would be a random event, and a random event is not something you did. It would happen to you, not through you. So Dennett distinguished two very different notions that are often confused. One is the idea of being free from every cause, of choosing in a way utterly disconnected from your history and character. The other is the idea of being able to act according to your own values, reasons, and considered desires, without being coerced, compelled, or manipulated. The first, he argued, is a fantasy, and not even an attractive one. The second is real, valuable, and worth defending. It is, in his memorable framing, the freedom worth wanting. Consider a practical example. Suppose you are offered a job in a distant city. You think it over for weeks. You weigh the opportunity against the friendships you would leave, the risk against the possibility, your ambitions against your comforts. In the end, you decide to go. Now, every part of that deliberation had causes. Your ambitions came from somewhere. Your fears had roots. The very way you weighed the options reflects the person your history made you. And yet, in every sense that matters for daily life, that was a free choice. No one forced you. You reasoned it through and acted on your own judgment. The presence of causes did not make you unfree. It is what allowed your values to reach into the world and steer your life. Contrast this with a case of genuine unfreedom. Suppose someone had secretly drugged you, or held your family hostage, or hypnotized you into wanting the move against your true wishes. Then, even though causes are again at work, we would rightly say you were not free, because the action did not flow from your own reasoning and values. It was imposed from outside them, or manufactured within you by manipulation. This, for the compatibilist, is the real and useful distinction, not between caused and uncaused, but between actions that express who we are and actions that override or bypass who we are. From this vantage point, much of the alarm generated by neuroscience begins to look misplaced. Suppose it is true that our choices have unconscious precursors, that the brain begins preparing before we are aware. So what? The compatibilist might reply. The brain that prepares is your brain. The processes that shape your choice are your processes, expressions of your particular history and character. That some of them run beneath awareness does not make them foreign. A choice does not have to be consciously micromanaged at every instant to be yours. It has to flow, in the right way, from the ongoing system that is you. It would be wrong to suggest that all philosophers accept this, or that compatibilists agree among themselves on every detail. There is vigorous disagreement about exactly what conditions an action must meet to count as free, about how to handle cases of coercion and manipulation, and about whether compatibilism truly answers the deepest worries or merely changes the subject. Critics argue that it defines freedom down, settling for a modest, workable notion, while quietly abandoning the grander idea people originally cared about. These debates are alive and unresolved. Still, compatibilism offers something valuable to anyone dizzy with the fear that science has abolished the will. It suggests that we may have been searching for freedom in the wrong place, high above the causal world, when the freedom that actually matters was here all along, woven into it. Not freedom from ourselves and our histories, but freedom to act as the selves our histories have made, guided by reason, responsive to value, and unforced. Whether that is enough, or whether it leaves something essential behind, is a question each of us must weigh. But it clears the ground for a further puzzle, one that turns the whole debate on its head by asking what a truly uncaused choice would even be. We have spent much of this journey worried that causes might rob us of freedom. Now let us try a strange reversal and ask what freedom would look like if we finally got our wish and escaped causation entirely. Imagine a choice with no causes at all, a decision that arose from nothing, connected to nothing that came before. Would that be the pure freedom we have been seeking? Or would it be something else altogether, something we would not want and could not call our own? Picture it concretely. Suppose that when you chose your left hand or your right, the decision was not shaped in any way by your history, your preferences, your mood, your reasons, or anything about you. Suppose it simply erupted, uncaused, from the void. In what sense would that choice be yours? It would not express your values, because your values did not touch it. It would not reflect your reasoning, because reasoning is a chain of causes, and this choice had none. It would not carry your character, because character is precisely the settled pattern of a person, and this event stood apart from all pattern. Such a choice would not be an act of freedom, it would be a kind of internal accident, a twitch of pure randomness, with no more claim to be your doing than a coin landing heads. This is the hidden trap in one popular picture of free will, the picture that imagines freedom as freedom from all causation. When we examine it closely, we find that it does not deliver control. It delivers randomness. And randomness is the opposite of what we mean by a free and responsible choice. If your decisions were truly uncaused, they would not be under your control at all, for control itself is a causal relationship. To control something is for your intentions to make a difference to what happens. Remove all causation, and you remove the very link by which a self could steer its own behavior. The dream of the uncaused choice followed to its end, does not lead to a sovereign will. It leads to chaos wearing the mask of freedom. This is why many thinkers have come to suspect that causes are not the enemy of agency, but its foundation. Consider what actually makes a choice feel like yours. It is that the choice grows out of things that are deeply you. Your love for another person, your memory of what has hurt or healed you, your goals, your concern for what is right, your hard-won understanding of the world. When you decide to care for someone at cost to yourself, that decision is powerful precisely because it flows from who you are. It is not random. It is the opposite of random. It is the expression, in action, of a whole history of feeling and thought. Strip away those causes, and you do not liberate the choice. You empty it of everything that made it meaningful. So perhaps the causes that shape a decision are not chains binding a prisoner. Perhaps they are more like the roots of a tree, the very things that allow it to stand, to grow, and to bear fruit. A choice without any roots in your reasons and values would not be freer. It would be weightless, disconnected, no longer an act of a self at all. The values, memories, and concerns that influence us may not be limits on our agency. They may be what our agency is made of. If this is right, then the whole question shifts beneath our feet. We began by fearing that if our choices have causes, they cannot be free. We end by suspecting that if our choices had no causes, they could not be ours. The meaningful decisions of a human life, the ones we most want to claim as our own, are saturated with causes, drenched in history, reason, and feeling, and that is exactly why they matter. The freedom worth having may never have been freedom from the forces that shaped us. It may be the freedom to act from them, as a coherent self, rather than against them or without them. Yet a further possibility remains, one that reaches beneath the level of ordinary causes altogether, into the strange foundations of matter itself. When the clockwork universe of classical physics seemed to leave no room for freedom, some looked hopefully toward a stranger and newer science for rescue. In the early 20th century, physicists exploring the world of the very small, the realm of atoms and particles, discovered something that shook the deterministic picture at its foundations. At this tiny scale, nature does not appear to behave like a perfectly predictable machine. Instead, it seems to involve genuine chance. In the quantum world, we cannot always say with certainty what a particle will do, only the probabilities of its various possible behaviors. Whether a particular atom will decay at a given moment, for instance, appears to be a matter of pure probability, not fixed in advance by any hidden detail. This is not merely a limit on our knowledge. On many interpretations, it reflects a genuine indeterminacy in nature itself. If that is so, then Laplace's dream of perfect prediction fails at the deepest level. Even an intelligence that knew everything about the present might not be able to calculate the future with certainty, because the future is not fully written. To those anxious about determinism, this discovery seemed to open a door. If the universe is not a closed clockwork after all, if there is real openness woven into its fabric, then perhaps human freedom could slip through the gap. Perhaps our choices are not fixed by the past, because nothing is fully fixed by the past. It is an appealing thought, and it has been raised many times in discussions of free will. But when we examine it carefully, it does not deliver what it seems to promise, and the reasons why are important. The central difficulty is this: indeterminacy is not the same as agency. Randomness is not the same as freedom. Suppose it were true that some quantum event in your brain was genuinely undetermined, that it could have gone one way or another with no prior cause fixing the outcome. How would that help? An uncaused, random event is not under your control. If your choice to lift your left hand ultimately traced back to a random quantum flicker, then your choice would be random, not free. We would simply have replaced the worry that our choices are determined by the past with an equally troubling picture in which they are partly the product of chance. Neither a predetermined choice nor a random one is the self-directed, meaningful choice we were hoping to find. A dice roll, in the depths of the brain, is no more an act of will than a predetermined chain would be. This is the trap we met in a different form when we considered the uncaused choice. Freedom is not achieved by injecting randomness into decision-making. A choice that is partly random is not thereby more yours. If anything, it is less yours, since it slips free of your reasons and control. So even if quantum indeterminacy is real, and even if it somehow reached up to influence the large, warm, noisy environment of the brain, which is itself a matter of scientific debate, it would not by itself hand us the freedom we seek. It might make our behavior less predictable. It would not make it more ours. We must also be careful to keep our categories clean, because this is a domain where confident overstatement flourishes. There is the established physics, the well-tested mathematics, that describes how quantum systems behave and predicts their probabilities with extraordinary accuracy. Then there is interpretation, the ongoing debate among physicists about what that mathematics means concerning the nature of reality, a debate that remains genuinely unsettled. Then there is philosophical argument, in which these ideas are brought to bear on questions like free will. And finally there is speculation, which sometimes wanders far beyond anything the physics supports. It is essential not to blur these together, because the blurring produces some of the most misleading claims in popular culture. Quantum physics does not show that our thoughts reshape external reality to match our wishes. It does not prove that consciousness controls the physical world, or that by thinking in a certain way we can command outcomes to appear. It does not establish that the mind collapses the universe into whatever it desires. These are not findings of physics. They are speculations that borrow the prestige of physics while leaving its actual content behind. The genuine science is stranger and more disciplined than these stories, and also more humble about what it does not yet understand. So the honest conclusion is careful. Quantum mechanics may well mean that the universe is not perfectly deterministic, that the future is not fully fixed by the past. That is a profound and fascinating possibility. But it does not, on its own, rescue free will, because the freedom we care about was never simply the absence of determinism. Randomness is not the missing ingredient. Whatever agency we possess, if we possess it, must be sought not in the dice of the subatomic world, but in the organized, meaningful activity of a whole living mind. And that returns us to the deepest question of all. What, exactly, is the self that all these processes are supposed to serve? Chapter 18. The Self Who Chooses. Throughout this journey, we have spoken constantly of a self, an I who chooses, deliberates, restrains, and acts. But we have not yet paused to ask what that word actually means. When you say, "I decided to lift my hand," who or what is the I making that claim? The question sounds simple, and turns out to be one of the most elusive in all of thought. For the self, examined closely, does not sit still to be inspected. One tempting answer is that the self is the conscious narrator, the inner voice that seems to sit behind the eyes, watching, commenting, deciding. This is the self of common speech, the little observer we imagine at the center of experience. But we have already seen how much of the mind operates outside this narrator's view. If most of what shapes our behavior happens unconsciously, then the conscious narrator cannot be the whole self. At most it is one part, one region of a much larger territory. To identify the self entirely with the voice in the head is to mistake a single instrument for the whole orchestra. Perhaps then, the self is the entire brain and body, the full living system, conscious and unconscious together. There is real wisdom in this, for it heals the false split between a person and their biology. On this view, the unconscious processes that prepare a movement are not something happening to you, they are you, as much as your conscious reflections are. When we discovered that neural activity may precede awareness, this is why it need not feel like a theft. The preparation and the awareness belong to the same self, the same unified system, even though only part of it is illuminated by consciousness at any moment. Or perhaps the self is something more like a continuing pattern, a thread of memory and character that persists through time. The atoms of your body are exchanged over the years. The cells turn over. Even your beliefs and moods shift. What makes the child you were and the person you are now, the same self, is not unchanging substance, but continuity. A pattern that carries forward, remembering, developing, holding a recognizable shape across a lifetime. On this view, the self is less like a thing and more like a river, always moving, never quite the same water, yet unmistakably one river from source to sea. Modern thinkers have added a further, subtler possibility. Perhaps the self is, in part, a model, something the brain constructs. Just as the brain builds a model of the outside world from sensory signals, it may also build a model of the person, a running self-representation that keeps track of the body, the history, the goals, and presents them as a unified center. On this account, the sense of being a single, continuous author is itself something the brain generates, a useful and largely accurate portrait, though a portrait nonetheless. This is a striking idea, and it is easy to misread it as saying the self is merely an illusion, a trick concealing the truth that no one is really there. But we should resist that hasty leap, for it confuses being constructed with being unreal. A great many real and important things are constructed, dynamic or emergent. Consider a whirlpool in a river. It is not a fixed object. It is a pattern, a process, continually made and remade by the water flowing through it. Yet it is entirely real. It has a shape, a location, effects. It can pull a leaf into its center, a hurricane, a flame, a melody, a living cell, a nation. All of these are patterns or processes rather than static things, and all of them are real and causally powerful. To say that the self is a dynamic, emergent process built by the brain is not to say that it is a phantom. It is to say what kind of real thing it is. This matters enormously for the question of freedom. If the self were an illusion, a mere spectator with no causal role, then the whole notion of a person choosing would collapse. But if the self is a real, if constructed process, a genuine organizing pattern in the brain and body that gathers memory, value, and reflection, and brings them to bear on action, then it can be a true participant in the making of a choice. The self who chooses need not be a ghost hidden behind the machinery, nor a fiction papering over emptiness. It may be the living, unfolding pattern of the whole person, emerging from the brain's activity and in turn shaping it. And if that is what a self is, then the crucial question becomes not whether such a self exists, but what role it truly plays when a decision is made. We arrive now at what may be the central mystery of the entire inquiry, the question toward which everything so far has been quietly leading. What does consciousness actually do? When a decision forms, is awareness the one making it, or merely the one watching it happen? This is where the neuroscience, the philosophy, and the felt texture of our lives all meet. And it is worth moving through slowly, because the honest answer is that we do not fully know, and the possibilities are profound. The first possibility is the most deflating, and it is the one the boldest readings of Libet's work suggested. On this view, consciousness is essentially a witness. The real work of deciding is done by unconscious processes, which prepare and initiate our actions. Awareness then lights up after the fact, and generates the comforting story that it was in charge all along. On this picture, the conscious self is like a spectator at a play who becomes convinced they are writing it, when in truth, the script was completed backstage. The feeling of authorship would be real as a feeling, but mistaken as an account of causation. Consciousness would ride along, narrating, but not steering. We have seen, though, that this stark picture rests on shakier foundations than it first appeared. The experiments that seemed to support it concerned trivial, arbitrary movements, and even those results admit of gentler interpretations. like the accumulator model, with its story of drifting neural noise. It is a genuine possibility, and we should not dismiss it. But it is very far from proven, and it may confuse a narrow finding about finger flicks with a sweeping claim about the whole of conscious life. So consider a second possibility, more balanced and, to many, more plausible. Perhaps conscious thought is not a mere observer, but a genuine participant in a larger decision-making system. On this view, awareness is one part of an extended process, contributing something distinctive that the unconscious parts do not. Conscious deliberation may be where information from many sources is brought together, held in mind, compared and integrated. It may be the stage on which competing considerations are weighed against one another, on which a distant goal can be kept in view while options are examined. The unconscious may propose, consciousness may help dispose. Rather than a witness pretending to rule, awareness would be a real contributor within a system too large for any single part to command alone. There is much to recommend this middle view. It fits the obvious fact that careful conscious reflection often does change what we decide. When you genuinely think a problem through, imagining consequences, questioning assumptions, the conclusion you reach depends on that thinking. It is hard to believe all of that rich, effortful reflection is a mere decoration, with no influence on the outcome. And it fits the sense that consciousness is especially involved, precisely in the novel, difficult, non-automatic choices, the ones that cannot be handled by habit alone. But there is a third possibility, subtler than the others, and perhaps the most important of all. It concerns not the single instant of a decision, but the long span of a life. Even if, in any given split second, awareness arrives after the first stirrings of an impulse, consciousness may exert its deepest influence across time, by slowly shaping the very systems from which future impulses arise. Consider what conscious reflection can do over days and years. It can direct attention, again and again, towards certain things and away from others, and attention shapes what the brain learns. It can adopt values and return to them until they sink below the surface and begin to guide behavior automatically. It can choose which habits to practice, which environments to enter, which company to keep, and each of these quietly reshapes the unconscious ground on which tomorrow's choices will form. This is a striking reversal of the deflating picture. It suggests that even if consciousness does not author each impulse in the moment, it may be the long-term gardener of the mind, cultivating the soil from which impulses grow. The reflection you engage in today, the ideas you dwell upon, the responses you practice, may become part of the automatic machinery of your future self. In this sense, a decision made consciously now can echo forward, becoming, in time, an inclination that arises on its own. The conscious self would then be not a helpless witness, nor merely a participant in single choices, but a slow sculptor of the whole system across a lifetime. If there is a place where something like freedom most plausibly lives, it may be here, in this long, patient, cumulative influence of awareness upon the mind that produces it. Not the dramatic power to conjure each impulse from nothing, but the quieter power to shape, over time, which impulses will arise, which will be followed, and which will fade. We may not command the next thought. We may still have a hand in becoming the kind of person from whom certain thoughts, rather than others, tend to come. And that possibility carries us naturally toward a different way of imagining freedom altogether, not as a fixed possession, but as something that can grow. We have been treating free will, for much of this journey, as though it were a single thing that one either has or lacks, present or absent, real or illusory. But perhaps that framing has misled us from the start. Perhaps freedom is not an all-or-nothing possession, but a capacity that exists in degrees, something a person can have more or less of, and, crucially, something that can be developed. Consider how differently the question looks once we allow that freedom might grow. Think of two people facing the same provocation. One has spent years cultivating self-awareness. They have learned to recognize the early signs of their own anger, the tightening, the heat, the first sharp impulse. They have practiced pausing, breathing, letting the surge crest and fall before responding. The other has done none of this. When provoked, the impulse seizes them and becomes action almost instantly, with no space between. In any meaningful sense, the first person is freer than the second, not because their biology is exempt from cause and effect, but because they have built, through practice, a wider space between impulse and action, and more capacity to choose what fills it. Freedom, here, is not a metaphysical gift, it is closer to a skill, and if it is something like a skill, then it can be cultivated. Knowledge enlarges it, for understanding our own patterns lets us anticipate and work with them, rather than being blindsided. Emotional regulation enlarges it, for a mind less flooded by reactivity has more room to reflect. Self-awareness enlarges it, for we can only govern what we can notice. Learning to recognize our personal triggers, to see the situations and states in which we tend to lose ourselves, gives us the chance to prepare, to step back, or to remove ourselves before the impulse takes hold. Even changing our environment enlarges our freedom, for we are so shaped by our surroundings that choosing better surroundings is one of the most powerful choices available to us. Underlying all of this is a genuine feature of the brain, one we should describe carefully and without exaggeration. The brain is not fixed hardware. It retains, throughout life, a capacity to change in response to experience, a property often called neuroplasticity. When we repeat a way of thinking or acting, the neural patterns that support it tend to strengthen. When we stop, they tend to weaken. This does not mean the brain can be reshaped instantly or without limit, and it does not justify grand promises. Change is usually slow, effortful, and partial, but the basic principle is real. What we practice, we tend to become more capable of. The pathways we use grow more traveled. The ones we neglect grow fainter. This gives a sober, grounded meaning to an idea that might otherwise sound merely inspirational. The thoughts, images, and ideas a person repeatedly returns to are not idle. Through the ordinary mechanisms of learning and attention, what we rehearse in the mind tends, over time, to influence what we expect, what we notice, what feels familiar, and how we are inclined to respond. A mind that regularly practices patience becomes, gradually, more patient by default. A mind that dwells constantly on threat becomes more prone to see threat everywhere. We are, in part, shaped by what we habitually hold in attention. This is not magic, and it guarantees nothing about the outer world. It is simply the slow, reliable way that repeated inner activity leaves its mark on the systems that generate our behavior. Here we should be honest about the limits, precisely so that the truth within the idea can be trusted. Rehearsing a thought does not summon external events into being. Imagining an outcome does not force the world to provide it. The influence we are describing runs inward, upon our own expectations, attention, habits, and identity, and through those, upon how we meet whatever the world presents. That is a real and considerable power, but it is a power over ourselves, not over circumstance. To claim more would be to trade a solid truth for an empty promise. Seen this way, the free will debate softens into something more livable and more hopeful. Even in a world of deep causation, even granting all that we did not choose, a space remains in which practice matters. We may not be able to step outside the causal order, but within it, by understanding ourselves, by learning to pause, by tending patiently to the habits of attention and response, we may become people through whom freer, wiser, more deliberate action can flow. The freedom that seems most real is not a fixed fact settled at birth. It is a capacity that a life can slowly enlarge. If our choices are shaped so deeply by causes we did not author, a difficult and consequential question follows. What becomes of responsibility? If a person's actions flow from their biology and their history, from a brain and a life they did not choose, can we still hold them accountable? And if we can, should the way we do so change? This is not an abstract puzzle. It touches how we treat one another, how we run our institutions, and how we respond to those who cause harm. One tempting reaction is to conclude that if free will is questionable, then responsibility must simply vanish, and with it, all consequences and all boundaries. But this moves far too quickly, and it misunderstands what a serious reckoning with causation actually implies. Even in a fully caused world, actions still have effects. People can still be dangerous or trustworthy, and societies still have every reason to protect their members, to discourage harm, and to encourage the behavior that lets people live together. The practical need for accountability does not disappear simply because we recognize that behavior has causes. What may change is not whether we respond, but the spirit in which we respond. Consider the difference between two attitudes toward wrongdoing. One is driven primarily by the desire to make the wrongdoer suffer, a kind of retribution that treats pain as a good in itself, deserved by a person imagined to have chosen their evil out of nothing. The other is oriented toward outcomes, toward protecting potential victims, preventing future harm, repairing damage where possible, and, where it can be done, helping the person become someone less likely to harm again. A deep appreciation of how behavior arises tends to pull us gently from the first attitude toward the second. If we truly grasp that a person's cruelty grew from causes, from a brain shaped by genes and injuries, and a history of its own, then the appetite for pure vengeance begins to seem less like justice and more like an echo of the very harm it condemns. This does not mean abandoning consequences. A society may still need to restrain those who are dangerous, to set firm limits, to impose costs that discourage harmful acts. Protection, prevention, and deterrence remain entirely legitimate, and understanding causes does not require flinging open every door. A person who understands why a river floods does not therefore build their house in its path. Understanding the causes of harmful behavior is compatible with taking that behavior seriously and acting decisively to limit it. What understanding changes is the emotional core of our response, softening cruelty without dissolving structure. There is also something clarifying in distinguishing responsibility from revenge. To hold someone responsible, in the useful sense, is to treat them as a person capable of responding to reasons, to expect better, to require repair, to insist on change. This is a form of respect, and it can coexist with compassion. Revenge, by contrast, seeks to inflict suffering for its own sake, and it tends to be indifferent to whether anything improves as a result. One looks forward, toward a better future. The other looks backward, toward an imagined debt of pain. A world that took the causes of behavior seriously might hold people every bit as accountable, but with less appetite for gratuitous suffering and more concern for what actually prevents harm and restores what can be restored. None of this settles the hard cases, and it would be dishonest to pretend it does. There are genuine and painful tensions here, between mercy and safety, between understanding and firmness, between the recognition that people are shaped by forces beyond them and the practical necessity of expecting them to meet standards nonetheless. These tensions cannot be dissolved by any tidy formula, and reasonable people, holding the same facts, will weigh them differently. This is territory where humility is essential, and easy answers are usually wrong. But the direction of the insight is clear enough to matter. Taking seriously how deeply behavior is caused does not lead, as some fear, to a collapse of all order into permissiveness. It leads, at its best, toward a stance that is at once firm and humane, one that protects and prevents and requires change, while releasing the cruelty that so often attaches itself to blame. Perhaps we can hold one another accountable without holding one another in contempt. Perhaps we can say no clearly and set limits without hatred. And that same movement, from blame toward understanding, from cruelty toward a firmer kind of care, reaches beyond courts and institutions into the most intimate corners of our own lives. The questions we have been exploring can seem distant and academic, matters for laboratories and lecture halls. But they reach, in the end, into the most personal places, into how we love, how we carry our regrets, and whether we can forgive others and ourselves. For if it is true that people act through histories, fears, and patterns they did not fully choose, then this understanding, held rightly, can change the texture of our closest relationships. Think of someone who has hurt you, not a stranger, but someone woven into your life. When we are wounded, we naturally see the other person as a free and simple agent who chose to harm us, and our pain hardens into a story of their pure fault. But suppose you could see, fully, everything that made them, the fears they inherited, the wounds inflicted on them before they could defend themselves, the patterns laid down in a childhood they did not select, the whole causal history that produced the person standing before you. This does not transform their harmful action into something acceptable, but it can transform your understanding of it, from an inexplicable act of malice into something that, however painful, arose from causes, as all human behavior does. And understanding of that kind can soften the grip of bitterness, not by excusing, but by explaining. Here we must be very careful and very clear, because compassion is easily distorted into something self-destructive. To understand the causes of someone's behavior is not to accept that behavior, nor to abandon your boundaries, nor to remain in a situation that harms you, nor to keep offering yourself to be hurt again. Understanding why a person acts as they do is entirely compatible with deciding that you will not tolerate it, that you will step back, protect yourself, and require different treatment. Compassion and boundaries are not opposites. One can grasp exactly how a person came to be harmful and, for that very reason, choose firmly to keep a distance. Insight is meant to free you from bitterness, not to trap you in harm. The same understanding can transform our relationship with regret. Many people carry their regrets as permanent sentences, returning again and again to some past choice with fresh self-punishment, as though endless suffering could undo what was done. But consider regret differently. The version of you who made that earlier choice was a different person, with less knowledge, less perspective, and a brain shaped by everything that had happened up to that point, and nothing that had happened since. That person acted as they were, given what they then were. This does not erase the harm or the loss, but it invites a gentler and more useful stance. Regret can become information rather than torment, a signal pointing toward what you now value and how you wish to act, rather than a wound you keep reopening. The pain of a regret can be honored by changing, not by suffering endlessly. And what of forgiveness? So often misunderstood as a kind of surrender. Forgiveness does not require pretending that harm did not happen, nor declaring that it did not matter, nor dissolving every boundary and welcoming further hurt. It can be something quieter and stronger, a decision to release the corrosive grip of resentment, for your own sake as much as anyone's, while still holding others and yourself to account. Forgiveness and accountability are not enemies. One can forgive in the sense of laying down the ongoing burden of hatred, and still expect change, still maintain limits, still insist that what was wrong was wrong. To forgive in this way is not weakness. It is a form of freedom, a refusal to let the past continue to dictate the emotional shape of the present. Perhaps this is where the long, careful inquiry into free will finally comes home. Whatever the ultimate truth about the will, an understanding of how deeply we are all shaped by what we did not choose can make us gentler, with others and with ourselves, without making us foolish or defenseless. It can loosen the grip of contempt and self-contempt, while leaving intact our capacity to protect what matters and to require what is right. To see clearly that people are formed by their histories, and to respond to that with a firm and clear-eyed compassion, may be one of the most humane uses to which this whole difficult question can be put. We come now to the question that lies beneath all the others, the one philosophers have circled for centuries, and the one against which every theory must finally be tested. Imagine that the universe could be rewound, like a film, to the precise moment you chose your left hand or your right. Every particle returned to exactly where it was. The same brain, in the same state, with the same memories, the same mood, the same history behind it, the same everything, down to the smallest detail. Now let the film play forward again. Could you have chosen differently? Or would you, of necessity, make exactly the same choice, every single time? This thought experiment is designed to isolate the very core of the free will question, stripped of all distraction. It asks not whether you feel free, nor whether your choice flowed from your values, but something more austere. Given precisely the same conditions, was more than one outcome genuinely possible? Different philosophical positions give different answers, and each answer has real strengths and real difficulties. It is worth holding them side by side, fairly, without rushing to crown a winner. The hard determinist answers plainly, no. If every event is fixed by prior causes, then in identical conditions the same choice must follow, as surely as the same equation yields the same solution. On this view, the sense that you could have done otherwise is an illusion produced by not knowing the full chain of causes. The strength of this position is its clarity and its fit with the causal order we observe everywhere in nature. Its difficulty is that it seems to clash violently with the lived experience of deliberation, and it struggles to make sense of the deep intuition that our reflection genuinely shapes what we do. Some also point to quantum indeterminacy as a challenge to the claim that outcomes are strictly fixed, though, as we have seen, mere randomness offers little comfort to freedom. The libertarian about free will, in the philosophical sense, answers the opposite. Yes, you genuinely could have chosen differently. This view holds that human beings possess a real capacity for choices that are not fully determined by the past, that, at the moment of decision, more than one future is truly open. Its strength is that it honors the powerful intuition that we are genuine originators of our actions, that the future is not sealed. Its great difficulty is explaining how such undetermined choices could be anything other than random, and how randomness could amount to control. If the same conditions could produce different choices, what determines which one occurs, without simply reintroducing either causation or chance? This is the persistent puzzle libertarian free will has never fully resolved. The compatibilist offers a different kind of answer, one that reframes the question rather than answering it head-on. They may grant that, in strictly identical conditions, the same choice would follow, but they deny that this robs us of freedom, because freedom for them was never about being able to do otherwise in exactly the same conditions. It was about acting from our own reasons and values, without coercion. The strength of this view is that it preserves a meaningful, usable notion of freedom and responsibility, even within a causal world, and it dissolves puzzles that trap the other positions. Its difficulty is that many people feel it quietly changes the subject, offering a freedom they can live with, while setting aside the deeper metaphysical question of whether the future was ever truly open. And there is the emerging picture of agency as something that genuinely arises at the level of the whole person, a real organizing process that gathers reasons, values, and reflection, and brings them to bear on action. On this view, the self is neither an illusion nor a ghost outside physics, but a real, higher-level pattern that does actual work in shaping behavior. Its strength is that it takes seriously both the physical basis of the mind and the reality of reflective agency. Its difficulty is that the precise relationship between such higher-level processes and the underlying physics remains philosophically contested and not fully understood. Set these four positions beside one another, and something becomes clear. Each captures something we do not want to lose, and each faces a problem it cannot easily solve. The determinist honors causation, but strains against lived experience. The libertarian honors our sense of open possibility, but struggles with randomness. The compatibilist preserves a workable freedom, but may sidestep the deepest question. The emergentist takes agency seriously, but leaves the metaphysics unfinished. This is not a sign that the question is foolish. It is a sign that it is genuinely hard, perhaps among the hardest we have ever asked. To pretend that one position has plainly triumphed would be to mistake preference for proof. The honest response is to hold the tension, to see the truth and the difficulty in each, and to let the question remain as open and alive as it truly is. Return with me now to where we began, to the finding that gave this whole inquiry its unsettling edge. Activity within the brain may stir before we become consciously aware of deciding. When we first met that idea, it carried a faint chill, a suggestion that something other than ourselves might be pulling the strings, that the conscious I was being quietly deceived. Having traveled so far, we are now in a position to meet that finding again, and to see it differently. The crucial reframing is this: even if a decision begins to take shape before it reaches awareness, that early activity is not the work of a stranger. It is not some alien force reaching in to move us against our will. The unconscious brain that begins preparing a choice is not separate from the person. It is the person in the parts that happen to work in darkness. When we imagined that preconscious activity meant the decision belonged to something other than us, we were still secretly picturing two beings, a true self of pure awareness and a shadowy mechanism beneath. But there are not two beings. There is one human being, most of whom operates below the surface of consciousness, and all of whom is equally you. Seen in this light, the unconscious preparation of a decision does not make the decision less yours. It reveals, instead, how much larger you are than the small, bright circle of your awareness. Your history, your learning, your values, your accumulated wisdom, and your accumulated wounds, all of these live in that unconscious depth, and all of them are present when a choice begins to form. When your brain leans toward one option before you consciously notice, it is not betraying you. It is bringing the whole of who you are to bear, most of which you cannot directly watch. The self that decides is not only the narrator in the lit room, it is the entire house, working together, arriving at a choice. Perhaps then, the conscious I is best understood not as a king issuing every command from a throne, but as something more like a navigator. Let me be clear that this is an image, a metaphor to think with, not a claim established by neuroscience. A navigator does not personally move every part of the ship. They do not turn the rudder with their own hands or drive the engines below. Much of the vessel operates through systems the navigator never directly touches. And yet the navigator is far from powerless. By reading the situation, setting the heading, choosing the destination, and adjusting the course over time, they shape where the whole ship goes, even though countless processes carry out the actual motion. The influence is real, but it is exercised through direction and cultivation across time, not through moment-to-moment command of every part. If consciousness is anything like this, then the discovery that decisions have unconscious beginnings loses its power to diminish us. Of course, the deep machinery starts turning before awareness arrives. That is how a mind so vast and mostly hidden must work. The question was never whether the conscious self personally initiates every micro-event in the brain. It plainly does not, and it never could. The more interesting question is whether the reflective, valuing, attending self, spread through the whole system, plays a genuine role in steering the life it is part of. And nothing in the neuroscience of early brain activity rules that out. A decision may indeed begin before you know it, but the you it begins within is larger than the knowing, and the beginning is still your own. As our long inquiry begins to settle, let us return, gently, to something simple enough to notice in your own experience. Here, wherever you are resting, between the arising of an impulse and the carrying out of an action, there is often a small interval, a quiet space. It may last only a moment, but in that space, something happens, or can happen, and much of what we have explored seems to gather there. A thought appears, unbidden, an urge rises on its own. This we do not command. The mind offers up its contents without asking permission, drawing on depths we cannot see. But then, in the space that follows, attention can turn toward the thought, or away from it. We can notice it, hold it, question it, or let it drift past, like a cloud crossing the sky. We do not choose the weather of the mind. We may have some influence over which passing clouds we follow, and which we allow to move on. This is a modest picture of freedom, and perhaps a truer one than the grander versions we set out hoping to find. It does not require standing outside the causal order, nor conjuring choices from nothing, nor escaping the long influence of all that shaped us. It asks only that we recognize the reality of that quiet space, and attend to what we do within it. The past has made us, deeply and undeniably. Yet the way we meet the present, the attention we bring, the reflection we practice, may become one of the causes that shapes what comes next. Understanding, once it enters us, does not leave us unchanged. It becomes part of the ground from which our future responses grow. We should hold these thoughts lightly, as possibilities to rest in, rather than conclusions to defend. It may be that our freedom is more limited than we once believed, hedged about by biology and history on every side. And it may be, at the same time, that degrees of freedom still matter enormously, that the difference between reacting blindly and responding with awareness is one of the most important differences there is. A narrow space is still a space. A small measure of influence, exercised faithfully over a lifetime, can slowly reshape a person. These are not final scientific verdicts. They are gentle possibilities, offered to be turned over in the quiet. Notice how the great debate softens when we bring it down to this human scale. The philosophers may never agree on whether the universe is deterministic, on whether we could have done otherwise in precisely identical conditions. Those questions may remain open for as long as we ask them. But the lived question, the one that touches how we actually spend our days, is smaller and more tender. Can we learn to pause? Can we grow a little more aware of the impulses that move through us? Can we tend, patiently, to the habits of attention that shape who we are becoming? These we can explore directly, without waiting for the metaphysics to be settled. So let the mind grow spacious for a moment. Let the impulses come and go, as they will, unbidden, from that hidden source. Let awareness rest lightly in the space between the impulse and the act, not straining to control, simply present, simply noticing. There is a kind of freedom that lives here, quiet and unforced, in the willingness to be aware of what arises before deciding what to do with it. It asks nothing dramatic of us. It asks only that we show up, gently, again and again, in the small interval where influence becomes possible. And in that showing up, over the long unfolding of a life, we may participate, more deliberately than we knew, in the slow becoming of the person we are. We have traveled a long way together, from a single choice between two hands to the deepest foundations of the self, and it is time to be honest about where we have arrived. We have not solved the mystery of free will. No one has. What we have done is something quieter and perhaps more valuable. We have learned to hold the question with greater care, to see what the evidence does and does not show, and to feel the true shape of what remains unknown. Science has taught us something genuinely humbling. Conscious awareness may not be the beginning of every decision. In the brain, preparation can precede the sense of choosing, at least for the simplest of acts. This is real, and it deserves our attention. But science has not shown that we are mere spectators of our lives, and the boldest claims made in its name reach far beyond what the experiments can support. The finger flicks of the laboratory are a long way from the great decisions of a human life, and between them lies a vast unmapped country that no scanner has yet charted. Philosophy, for its part, has taught us that much of our confusion comes from what we expect the word freedom to mean. Chase a freedom that floats entirely free of all causes, and you find it dissolves into randomness, which is no freedom at all. Ask instead for a freedom that lets us act from our own reasons and values, that grows with self-understanding, that lives in the space between impulse and action, and you find something that may survive even in a causal world. The meaning of freedom turns out to depend, in part, on what we were seeking when we asked for it. And neuroscience, honest neuroscience, has not produced a final, universally accepted answer, and it may be a long time before it does, if it ever can. The mind studying itself is engaged in one of the strangest tasks imaginable, and the deepest questions about consciousness and agency remain genuinely open. Anyone who tells you the matter is closed, in either direction, has mistaken their preference for a proof. The intellectually honest position, for now, is a kind of rich uncertainty, alive with possibility rather than emptied by doubt. So let us end not with a verdict, but with a possibility offered gently, to carry with you into sleep. Perhaps freedom was never meant to be the absence of all influence. Perhaps a life without influence would not be a free life at all, but a weightless one, disconnected from everything that gives choice its meaning. Perhaps freedom, in the only form we could ever actually possess, includes the growing ability to understand the forces that move through us, to reflect upon them, and to participate, a little more deliberately with each passing year, in the person we are slowly becoming. Not freedom from what shaped us, but freedom to take some part in shaping what comes next. Return, one last time, to that small choice you made at the very beginning, the rising of a hand, left or right. You felt yourself decide, and now you know that a great deal was happening beneath that feeling, in depths you could not see. So ask yourself, softly, not needing an answer tonight, did you create that choice? Or did you watch it forming? Or did you take part in something larger than your awareness could contain? The honest reply may be that these are not truly separate. The one who watches, the depths that prepare, and the self that acts, may all be the same being, seen from different sides. We may never fully know where a decision begins, but it begins within us, in the whole of what we are, most of it hidden, all of it ours, and in the quiet space where the next impulse waits to arise, unmeasured and unfinished, the question of who we are becoming remains, always, a little way open. If you enjoyed this journey, you are welcome to subscribe to Sleep into Power for more calm explorations of history, consciousness, philosophy, and the mysteries of the human mind. Sleep well and sleep into power, guys. Good night.